Berlin, July 1940. On a long table inside the German High Command, aerial photographs are spread out like a map of an already won war. France fell in 6 weeks. 6 weeks. For one of the most powerful armies on earth. Now the officers of the Wehrmacht look north, across a thin strip of gray water, at what should be an even easier prize. They see the coastline of southern England, magnified in grainy black and white. And in some of those photographs, men in mismatched clothing, some without a single rifle between 3 of them, standing behind hay carts dragged into the road as barricades. A few carry weapons that make the analysts pause, then almost laugh out loud. Pikes. Actual pikes. Bayonets welded onto broom handles, because there simply aren't enough rifles to go around. This, the intelligence reports conclude, is what passes for Britain's second line of defense. An army of shopkeepers, farmers, and grandfathers too old for the regular forces. Britain herself is calling them a joke. The newspapers back home already have a nickname for them. One that will outlive the war itself? Dad's Army. Case closed. The officers in Berlin seem to think they are about to be proven catastrophically wrong. Not in one single battle. Not in one dramatic afternoon on a beach. But across the 4 years that followed, this mocked, under-equipped, half-armed rabble would transform itself into something German war planners could never quite discount again, a force so dug in, so unpredictable, so ready to make every hedge, every church tower, every lane, a fight, that the invasion Berlin seemed so certain of was quietly shelved, and never came at all. This is the story of how Britain turned its own joke into its shield. To understand why anyone thought pikes and hay carts were a serious plan, you have to understand exactly how bad things were in the summer of 1940. 3 weeks earlier, over 300,000 British and Allied soldiers had just been pulled off the beaches of Dunkirk in one of the most desperate evacuations in military history. Alive, yes, but almost entirely without their weapons. Rifles, machine guns, artillery, tanks, nearly all of it left behind on the sand, abandoned in the chaos, now sitting in German hands. Britain's regular army, the force that was supposed to defend the island, had in effect come home with nothing but the uniforms on their backs. And the intelligence reports weren't lying. Hitler's forces stood just 21 miles away, across the English Channel, fresh from conquering Poland, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France in less than a year. 21 miles. On a clear day, you could stand on the cliffs of Dover and see German-occupied territory with your own eyes. Winston Churchill, only weeks into his premiership, had to face an almost unthinkable question. If the invasion comes now, who exactly is going to stop it? The regular army needed months to re-equip. Months Britain didn't have. So, on the evening of the 14th of May 1940, the government made a desperate radio appeal. Any man between 17 and 65, not currently serving, who wanted to defend his home, come forward. They expected perhaps 150,000 volunteers. Within 24 hours, more than 250,000 men had turned up at police stations across the country. Within 6 weeks, that number passed 1.5 million. And almost none of them had a weapon to carry. This was the raw material Britain had to turn into a shield against the most feared war machine on the planet: postmen, teachers, butchers, men who'd fought in the trenches of the First War 20 years earlier, boys not yet old enough for the regular army, standing at crossroads with nothing but their own resolve, and, if they were lucky, a shotgun from home. There was no single genius handed a secret laboratory for this one. No lone maverick summoned back from disgrace to build a wonder weapon in isolation. The underdog here wasn't one man. It was all of them. It was the First World War veteran who hadn't held a rifle in 2 decades, now drilling teenagers on a village green with a walking stick standing in for a bayonet. It was the retired colonels who suddenly found themselves in command again. Not because the army trusted them with real soldiers, but because there was no one else. And from the very first week, the ridicule was instant and relentless. The press quickly nicknamed the new force "Look," Duck and Vanish, a cruel play on the initials of their official name. The local defense volunteers. Cartoonists drew them as bumbling old men waving pitchforks at parachutes. Regular army officers rolled their eyes at units that drilled with broom handles because there was nothing else to drill with. Some of it was fair. In those first weeks, this was honestly barely an army at all. Men reported for duty in their own clothes, wearing nothing but an armband to show they were official. Entire units shared a single working rifle between 40 or 50 volunteers, taking turns holding it during patrol, passing it hand to hand as the shift changed. They stood watch at night over harbors, factories, crossroads, and radar stations. Armed, in the truest sense of the word, with almost nothing. And yet they kept coming. Farmers who knew every hedge and gate on their land better than any regular soldier ever could. Fishermen who knew the coastline in the dark. Miners used to working in the most brutal conditions imaginable. Winston Churchill, watching all of this, refused to see the joke that the newspapers saw. He saw something else entirely, a force rooted in the land itself that would fight for every field because it was their field. Men who did not need to be told why they were fighting. Because the enemy they were watching for might be visible from their own front door. By July 1940, he gave this scattered, half-armed mass of volunteers an official name that has endured ever since: the Home Guard. What happened next was one of the strangest improvised arsenals in modern military history. With almost no rifles to spare, every one the country could scrape together was going to the regular army. Still rebuilding after Dunkirk, the Home Guard had to be equipped with whatever was left. And what was left was, frankly, absurd. There were the pikes. Real, honest steel pikes, First World War bayonets, welded onto long wooden poles. Because someone in the War Office decided a spear was better than an empty pair of hands. Photographs from the summer of 1940 show grown men, some in their 60s, drilling in formation with medieval weapons against an enemy that had just conquered half of Europe with tanks and dive bombers. Then came the Blacker bombard, a squat, ugly spigot mortar that looked like something bolted together in a garden shed, because in some cases it practically was. No barrel, no complex mechanism, just a heavy steel rod that punched a bomb forward when struck, hard enough to crack open the thin top or rear armor of a tank. But only if the man operating it held his nerve at frighteningly close range. Then the Northover projector, little more than a metal drainpipe on a wooden stand, designed to lob glass bottles filled with a crude incendiary mixture at approaching vehicles. A drainpipe against panzers. Add to this the sticky bomb, a glass sphere coated in adhesive, meant to be pressed directly onto the side of a tank by hand before the thrower dived for cover. And you start to understand why regular soldiers struggle to keep a straight face. Government instructions issued that same summer went further still, suggesting that without a proper weapon, anything sharp lashed to a pole would have to do. Every single piece of this arsenal looked like something from a village fete. Not a battlefield. But look closer, and a pattern emerges. A sticky bomb pressed against a tank's thin rear armor could cripple it. A Blacker bombard, dug into a hedgerow at a blind bend in a country lane, could stop a column dead before it ever saw the ambush. A drainpipe full of fire, fired from a ditch at point-blank range, does not care how ridiculous it looks the moment it works. The Home Guard was never going to win a war of maneuver in open country against panzer divisions. Nobody pretended otherwise. But that was never really the plan. The real weapon the Home Guard carried wasn't in their hands at all. It was in what they knew, and in what the enemy could never be certain of. Every man in that thin, ridiculed line understood his own ground with a precision no invading force could match on its first day ashore. Which gate stuck? Which hedge hit a firing position? Which lane narrowed to a single vehicle width, perfect for an ambush, with nothing more than a sticky bomb and steady hands? Across the country, stop lines were dug networks of pillboxes, trenches, and anti-tank obstacles designed to turn any advance into a brutal, grinding series of small, vicious fights, hedge by hedge, village by village, rather than one decisive battle Germany could win in an afternoon. And this was not theoretical readiness. Real danger found the Home Guard constantly, even without an invasion. Through the Blitz, they stood their posts on rooftops and in fields, while German bombers passed overhead night after night, watching for parachutes. Because German aircrew genuinely did come down over English soil, and when they did, it was very often a farmer or a shopkeeper with a shotgun and an armband who reached them first. Picture that moment from the other side. A Luftwaffe pilot, trained, decorated, confident, drifts down, expecting to be picked up by his own advancing forces within days. And instead, here's the unmistakable double click of a shotgun being cocked, and looks up to find a 60-year-old greengrocer holding at steady a weapon he has never fired in anger before, and is not about to let that stop him now. Stories like that spread among German aircrew, and eventually among the planners studying whether an invasion of England was really the formality it had first appeared to be. Because an army that can be defeated in one battle is a calculation. An entire population that refuses to simply stand aside is something closer to a nightmare enemy with no single front line to break. No headquarters to bomb and to surrender. Just millions of ordinary people who know their own streets better than any invader ever could, and are prepared to make every single one of them a fight. That uncertainty, that was the real psychological weapon the Home Guard carried. Not one bomb, not one battle, just the growing, gnawing doubt in Berlin that this coastline would ever be the easy prize the photographs once suggested. But there is a darker, quieter side to this story. One the Home Guard's own success helps to explain. Because there was one part of the British Isles where this shield was never allowed to form at all. In June 1940, as the local defense volunteers were just beginning to gather with their pikes and borrowed shotguns, the British government made a colder, more painful calculation about a small cluster of islands sitting far closer to occupied France than to England itself. The Channel Islands, Jersey, Guernsey, Alderney, Sark, too close, too exposed, too difficult to supply and defend with the little Britain had left after Dunkirk. London made the decision to demilitarize them completely. No Home Guard, no pillboxes, no stop lines. The islands were declared open, undefended, not worth the cost of holding. The message did not travel cleanly. Days later, German bombers, unsure whether the islands truly were undefended, struck the harbors anyway. And then, German forces landed to find no resistance waiting for them at all. For the next 5 years, the Channel Islands became the only part of British soil ever occupied by Nazi Germany. There was no shield of ordinary men who knew every lane and hedge. No Home Guard digging in behind a stop line. There was only occupation. Forced labor building fortifications along the coast, requisitioned homes, shortages that grew crueler with every passing year, and a population that spent 5 years waiting for a liberation that, for the rest of Britain, never had to be waited for at all. That is the cost of the alternative. Not a single dramatic battle lost, but years of quiet, grinding occupation, borne by people who were simply never given the chance the mainland was given. The chance to be underestimated, to be laughed at, and to turn that mockery into a wall the enemy never dared test. Whatever else can be said about the pikes, the drainpipes, the broom handles standing in for rifles, the Home Guard gave mainland Britain something the Channel Islands were never allowed to have. A line, however thin, however ridiculous it looked on paper, that stood between an army and an open door. The invasion the officers in Berlin studied so carefully in the summer of 1940 never came. Operation Sea Lion was postponed again, and finally shelved for good, the product of converging failures for German planners, from the battle in the skies above southern England to the growing doubt about what waited for them on the ground below. The Home Guard stood watch for 4 more years after that, manning anti-aircraft guns as the Blitz gave way to the terror of the V-1 flying bombs, disposing of unexploded ordnance in the streets where they lived, freeing hundreds of thousands of regular soldiers for the front lines, simply by continuing to guard the home ground no one else was free to guard. In December 1944, with the invasion threat finally truly gone, The Home Guard stood down for the last time. Many of the men who had marched with pikes 4 years earlier marched again, this time in farewell parades, in front of the very public that had once mocked them as a joke. That nickname never went away. If anything, Britain grew to love it. Dad's army would go on to become one of the most beloved names in the country's memory of the war, not spoken with ridicule any longer, but with something closer to affection and respect. Because somewhere between the pikes on that village green and the stop lines dug into the English countryside, this ragtag, under-equipped, endlessly mocked collection of volunteers had quietly done exactly what Berlin's intelligence officers, poring over those aerial photographs in the summer of 1940, never once believed they could. They had turned a joke into a wall Hitler's tanks never had to test.